Hey everyone and welcome. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the shuro button and give this video a thumbs up. 1 God, please no. I'm checking the airway. Keep pumping. Got it. And 2 people died instantly at Sidwell's dinner party. ABC General Hospital spoilers. Port Charles has seen its fair share of chaos over the years. Mob wars, betrayals, shocking returns from the dead, but nothing could have prepared the town for the horrifying events that unfolded at Sidwell's lavish dinner party. What was supposed to be an evening of power plays, secret alliances, and carefully masked hostility quickly spiraled into one of the most shocking tragedies the city has experienced in a long time. By the end of the night, 2 people would be dead. And the most disturbing part, it might not have been an accident. The night began innocently enough, at least on the surface. Sidwell, a man known for his quiet influence and mysterious connections, had invited some of Port Charles's most prominent figures to a formal dinner at his estate. The invitation list alone raised eyebrows. When people like Sonny, Carly, Ava, and several other powerful figures receive invitations to the same event, it's never just about food and polite conversation. Everyone knew something bigger was going on. Still, no one expected it to end in bloodshed. As the guests began arriving, the tension in the air was already noticeable. Carly was among the first to step through the doors of Sidwell's estate, immediately sensing something was off. The atmosphere felt unusually stiff, almost like everyone was waiting for something to happen. She wasn't wrong. Sonny arrived shortly after, and the moment he locked eyes with Sidwell, it was clear that the 2 men shared a complicated history. Their brief handshake looked polite to outsiders, but underneath the surface was an unmistakable layer of distrust. Meanwhile, Ava kept her distance, carefully observing the room. Ava's many things bold, calculating, and incredibly perceptive. She could tell that several guests weren't there just for dinner. They were there for answers. And maybe even revenge. As cocktails were served and conversations began to flow, the real game started. Sidwell moved through the room like a master chess player, speaking privately with different guests, dropping subtle hints about deals, secrets, and future plans. Some guests left those conversations looking intrigued. Others looked deeply unsettled. Carly eventually cornered Sonny near the bar, lowering her voice as she asked the question everyone was thinking. What exactly did Sidwell invite us here for? Sonny didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched Sidwell across the room, studying his every move. That's what I'm trying to figure out, Sonny finally replied. Across the room, things were beginning to escalate. One particular conversation between Ava and another guest quickly turned heated. Ava accused them of hiding something, while the other person insisted that Sidwell was manipulating everyone. It wasn't long before other guests started noticing the argument. But Sidwell seemed completely unbothered. In fact, he looked almost amused. That's when the dinner was announced. Everyone gathered around the massive dining table, which was set with elegant silverware, crystal glasses, and elaborate dishes prepared by Sidwell's private chef. The setup looked like something straight out of a high-end magazine. Yet, despite the luxury, no one felt comfortable. There were too many secrets in that room, too many grudges. Sidwell stood at the head of the table and raised his glass, offering a calm, measured toast. To new beginnings, he said. Some guests raised their glasses, others hesitated, and then everything changed. Started with a single scream. One of the guests suddenly collapsed in their chair, knocking over their glass as their body hit the table. At first, people assumed it was some kind of medical emergency. But within, another guest slumped forward in exactly the same way. Panic erupted instantly. Chairs scraped across the floor as people jumped to their feet. Someone shouted for help. Another guest rushed forward to check for a pulse, but it was already too late. Both victims were dead. Just like that, the realization hit the room like a shock wave. Two people had died within of each other, and the horrifying possibility began to sink in. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had poisoned the dinner. Carly immediately backed away from the table, her instincts kicking in. Sunny quickly moved to her side, scanning the room for any suspicious movement. Ava looked pale, but composed, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what had just happened. Sidwell, however, remained eerily calm. Too calm. He slowly set his glass down and surveyed the chaos unfolding around him, which raised the biggest question of all. Did Sidwell know this was going to happen, or worse, was he responsible? Within, accusations began flying across the room. Some guests demanded answers from Sidwell, while others insisted that someone else must have tampered with the food. But one thing was certain. Whoever planned this had done it carefully because the victims were very specific targets. And that meant this dinner party might have been a trap from the very beginning. Meanwhile, Sunny quietly pulled Carly aside, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of here," he said. Carly nodded, but her eyes were still locked on the table where the two bodies remained. "Sunny, this wasn't random," she whispered. He knew she was right. The question now was who was the real target? Because if someone was willing to kill two people in a room full of powerful enemies, then the night might not be over yet, and the next victim could already be sitting at the table. The elegant evening at Windmere was supposed to be one of the most exclusive social gatherings Port Charles had seen in times. But by the time the night ended, it had turned into a horrifying tragedy that would leave the entire city shaken to its core. General Hospital spoilers reveal that Sidwell's long anticipated regale party was meant to be a calculated move. A night of luxury, manipulation, and secrets disguised behind Diada's spectacles and polished grins. Influential guests from all corners of Port Charles arrived dressed in their finest vesture, ignorant that the evening would end with two people dead and several lives permanently changed. From the moment guests stepped into the lavish estate, there was an unsettling pressure in the air. Sidwell had precisely named the guest list, inviting people whose histories were tangled with secrets, backstabbings, and undetermined conflicts. Among the attendees were power players like Sunny, Corinthos and Carly Spencer, both cautious of Sidwell's motives, but curious enough to attend. Jason Morgan kept a vigilant eye on the room, seeing that commodity about the gathering felt wrong, while Anna Dean studied every commerce with the instincts of a seasoned investigator. Sidwell ate his guests with a fascinating smile, raising a toast that sounded polite on the face, but carried a subtle undertone of challenge. As the regale progressed, exchanges grew sharper and pressures coddled beneath the polite face. Old grievances resurfaced, alliances shifted, and allegations began flying. And hushed whispers across the dining table. Sidwell appeared to be orchestrating it all, subtly pushing certain guests to defy each other while he watched with quiet satisfaction. But no bone realized that the real drama of the night had yet to begin just as the main course was served. The atmosphere changed dramatically. One guest suddenly collapsed, transferring their president crashing backward onto the marble bottom. At first, people assumed it was a medical exigency, but the horror escalated when an alternate guest fell. Moments laterally, heaving for breath before going fully still. Fear erupted incontinently. Spectacles shattered as guests jumped to their bases and the elegant dining room converted into chaos. Someone cried for help while others desperately tried to check for signs of life, but it snappily came clear that both victims had failed nearly incontinently. The consummation that two people had been killed in the middle of a apparently private regale party transferred shock waves through the room. Sunny incontinently suspected foul play, his instincts telling him This was no accident. Jason moved snappily to secure the area, precluding anyone from leaving until they could determine what had happened. Meanwhile, Anna's investigative instincts demurred in as she examined the table, the spectacles, and the food that had just been served. It didn't take long before a nipping possibility surfaced. The victims may have been poisoned. As the remaining guests plotted to reuse what they had just witnessed, attention sluggishly shifted toward Sidwell himself. After all, it was his regale party, his guest list, and his staff who had prepared the food and drinks. Some guests began brooding that the entire event might have been a setup, a deadly trap designed to exclude specific targets. Carly brazened Sidwell directly, demanding to know what kind of crooked game he was playing. Yet, Sidwell appeared authentically stupefied, averting he'd no idea what had happened, and that he'd no way risk such a public disaster. Still, his calm address only made some guests more suspicious. As authorities were called and the estate was placed on lockdown, the pressure among the survivors grew indeed more violent. Everyone realized that if Bain had been involved, the intended targets might not have been the Bones who failed. That intimidating study meant someone differently at the table could have been the real victim, and the killer might still be standing among them. Jason still advised Sonny that this could be part of a larger scheme, conceivably tied to adversaries who wanted to strike at Port Charles's most important numbers in one ruinous move. Meanwhile, Anna began questioning each guest, looking for inconsistencies in their stories and signs of retired motives. Several people had reasons to want others at that table dead, and the deeper she dug, the more complicated the situation came. What made the riddle indeed more disturbing was the discovery that one of the victims had lately uncovered sensitive information that could have exposed a dangerous secret in Port Charles. That disclosure suggested the murders might have been precisely planned rather than an arbitrary act of violence. However, they had done so with perfection and confidence, knowing exactly when and where to strike if someone had designedly poisoned the victims. As word of the shocking death spread through the megacity, the fallout began incontinently. Musketeers and family members of the victims demanded answers, while rumors spread that the regale party butchery might only be the morning of commodity far more minatory. Sonny came decreasingly convinced that the incident was connected to a growing power struggle in the felonious demi-world, while Anna suspected a more complex conspiracy involving retired alliances and long-buried secrets. The intimidating reality was that no bone at that regale table could be fully trusted. As the disquisition boosted, alliances began to fracture, and paranoia grew among those who had survived the deadly evening. Each guest knew that their presence at the party had placed them in the center of a murder riddle that could fluently claim more victims. For Sidwell, the tragedy hovered to destroy his character and conceivably expose secrets he'd worked hard to keep retired. Yet for others in Port Charles, the double death might reveal trueness that had been buried for times. What started as an elegant regale meant to impress the city's nobility had turned into one of the most shocking events in recent memory. With 2 people dead incontinently and numerous questions still unanswered, the fate of Sidwell's regale party promises to enkindle new conflicts, expose dangerous secrets, and set off a chain response of vengeance and jubilation that will ripple across Port Charles for weeks to come. And if the killer's true target wasn't one of the victims who failed that night, also, the most intimidating possibility remains: the real plan may still be unfolding. I just can't hold it in anymore. It's just too much. Sighs and gasps. The shock that followed the tragedy at Sidwell's regale party continued to ripple across Port Charles long after the authorities arrived. And what originally sounded like a horrifying but isolated incident snappily began to look like the opening move in a far more dangerous game. The estate remained sealed as investigators trolled through every inch of the lavish dining room, collecting spectacles, plates, and indeed fractions of food that might reveal how the deadly bane had been delivered. In the center of it all stood the guests who had survived the night. each one shaken and still wondering whether they themselves had been the intended target. In the days that followed, the city of Port Charles buzzed with enterprise. News of the double death spread fleetly, dominating exchanges and services, homes, and cafes. As people tried to erect together what had really happened at the elite gathering hosted by Sidwell, the woeful event snappily came one of the most shocking developments in recent history on General Hospital, and the disquisition promised to expose secrets that some residers had spent times trying to bury. At the center of the unfolding riddle was the growing jubilation that the victims might not have been arbitrary casualties. Anna Dean began reviewing every moment of the evening, reconstructing the timeline of the regale from the moment guests arrived until the fatal collapse. According to the substantiations, everything had sounded normal until the wine was poured just before the main course. That detail incontinently caught Anna's attention. However, the wine. Second. Spectacles could have been the delivery system, meaning someone might have tampered with specific drinks rather than polluting the entire table if Bain had been involved. That proposition raised a disturbing question. Was someone at the party precisely targeting particular individualities? Meanwhile, Jason Morgan and Sonny Corinthos began conducting their own quiet disquisition. Sonny had survived in numerous pitfalls during his time in Port Charles, and his instincts told him the incident had all the emblems of a strategic attack. He wondered if one of his adversaries had used the regale party as the perfect occasion to strike while several important numbers were gathered in one place. Jason agreed that the situation felt orchestrated. The guest list alone made the event a tempting target. Some of the most influential people in the mega-city had been seated at that table, and barring indeed one of them could shift the balance of power in ways that would profit certain retired adversaries. While Sonny concentrated on implicit felonious motives, Anna's disquisition uncovered another disking possibility. One of the victims had lately been involved in uncovering sensitive information that could have exposed corruption within Port Charles. That discovery suggested the murder might not have been about vengeance or gang warfare at all, but rather an advised attempt to silence someone permanently. However, the alternate death might have been contributo damage, a woeful mistake that passed because the bane reached the wrong glass. If that was true, as the disquisition strengthened, jubilation sluggishly began circling back toward the host of the party himself. Sidwell claimed he'd been just as shocked as everyone differently when the guests collapsed. But several details raised questions about his part in the night's events. For one thing, Sidwell had tete-a-tete overseen the guest list, inviting people whose histories were filled with complicated battles. Some wondered if he designedly placed adversaries together in the same room, knowing conflict was ineluctable. When Carly Spencer brazened him, she indicted him of manipulating the entire evening for his own mysterious docket. Sidwell denied the blameworthiness, claiming he'd hoped the gathering would help repair fractured connections in Port Charles rather than destroy them. But Carly was aunt-induced. She had seen too numerous dangerous situations in her life to believe the tragedy was simply an unfortunate coincidence. However, also they had done so with perfection and tolerance, staying for the perfect moment when the room was full of substantiations and confusion would make it easier to escape jubilation. If someone had planned the murders, the killer could have been someone on the guest list. Someone who slipped Bain into a glass while everyone was detracted by discussion and horse laugh. The pressure among the surviving guests grew heavier as the days passed. Each person who had attended the regale realized they might be under jubilation, and every discussion felt like an interrogation. Some began reconsidering their recollections of the night, searching for any detail they might have overlooked. One guest recalled seeing a garçon briefly vacillate while pouring the wine, while another flashed back, noticing someone leaving the table just moments before the collapse. These small fractions of memory sluggishly began forming a mystification that investigators were hopeless to break. For Sonny and Jason, the situation came indeed more critical when they learned that several adversaries of Sonny had lately been operating still in the region. However, the regale party might have been just the morning if one of them had orchestrated the attack. A single dramatic event could destabilize Port Charles and distract everyone from a larger plan unfolding in the MC. Sonny knew that whoever was responsible might formally be preparing their coming move. Meanwhile, Anna made a discovery that boosted the riddle indeed further. Primary forensic results indicated that the bane used in the murders was rare and extremely delicate to gain. That meant the killer probably had access to specialized coffers or connections able of supplying such a substance. The disclosure narrowed the list of suspects, but also raised the possibility that the crime involved someone with important abettors. Back at the estate, investigators continued examining security footage from the property. Cameras captured several moments that raised eyebrows, including a brief period when the dining room lights flitted just before the wine was served. During those minutes of distraction, several guests had shifted positions around the table, making it nearly insolvable to determine who might have tampered with the drinks. It was the perfect cover for someone determined to strike without being seen. As Port Charles plotted to recover from the shocking deaths, the emotional impact began affecting the lives of nearly everyone connected to the tragedy. Families of the victims demanded justice, while those who survived the regale party were visited by the intimidating memory of watching two people collapse in front of them. The elegant gathering that had been meant to showcase wealth and influence had rather revealed how fragile life could be in a city filled with secrets and battles. Yet, the most unsettling possibility remained unsolved. Investigators still couldn't confirm whether the victims had been the true targets of the poison. However, also the real ideal of the attack had failed. If the killer had intended to exclude someone differently at that table, that meant the person responsible might try again, determined to finish what they started. For Sonny, Jason, Anna, and the rest of Port Charles, the tragedy at Sidwell's regale party marked the morning of a new and dangerous chapter. Trust between abettors was beginning to deteriorate. Hidden motives were coming to light, and every new indication sounded to consolidate the riddle rather of working it. As the hunt for the killer boosted, one nipping verity became insolvable to ignore. The person responsible for the double death was likely someone who had been sitting at that veritably table, participating grins and discussion just moments before the bane struck. And until that person was unmasked, no bone in Port Charles could truly feel safe.